the space. Everyone can hear us now. And we have people joining us, which is really lovely. Some of whom I've already seen today, so that's even better. I think I'll just mention it is that you will see my cursor move from time to time. It's while I move the controls, so please ignore it. So good afternoon, everyone. We're just waiting for people to gather. So if people want to make themselves comfortable just for a couple of minutes while we wait for the room to fill with everybody who's booked. So I think we're just over half full on the tickets we've had reserved. So we will just take a couple more minutes to allow people that time to join.
Oh, I have a, should I talk?
Okay, we have a steady number who've joined us. Can I say good afternoon to everybody who's here? And I'm Anita Taylor. I'm the co-founder of the Trinity Buoy Wharf, or the founder of the Trinity Buoy Wharf Drawing Prize and of Drawing Projects UK. I'm also the Dean of Duncan of Jordenston College of Art and Design at the University of Dundee. And I'm really thrilled to be able to welcome you all to this drawing discussion this afternoon with one of the Trinity Buoy Wharf Drawing Prize 2020 exhibitors, Hormazd Narielwalla, and I'll learn to say it properly as we go through the conversation, and Emma Hill. So we're really, really thrilled to have Hormazd and Emma with us, and we're really excited to share in the drawing discussions a conversation around drawing. I know that some people in the audience have joined us already for some of the online events. They're all slightly different, but the drawing discussions were set up as part of the Drawing Projects UK programme, normally in person and normally to create a networking opportunity to think about, to talk about, and to look at drawings. That's our remit. It's about building a community through drawing on that basis. So the drawing discussions for us are really important, and we recognise that by going online, we're able to reach people in a very different way. And it's a real privilege to be able to share the programme that we have, and the support that we've had from Arts Council England has supported us being able to open the show and at Drawing Projects UK in Wiltshire, and also to deliver a programme of talks, events, and to have an artist in residence. So without further ado, this is in a webinar format. It is recorded, And the format for the event is that we will talk about the drawing that's been selected for the exhibition, but we'll then have a conversation between Emma and Hormazd, and then there'll be questions and answers. But you're able to use the Q&A function to ask questions at any moment during the conversation, and then we'll come to the questions once we've had the in-conversation towards the latter part of the hour, but within probably about 35 minutes. So welcome everybody. It's really great to see everybody here. The drawing that we have in the exhibition is an artist's book by Hormazd, but I wonder if Emma and Hormazd, you'd like to introduce yourselves before we talk about the drawing, and you might need to unmute. I'm sorry to... That's great. That's really fantastic. So if you would like to introduce yourselves, that would be really amazing. And Hormazd, you should go first, and then we'll talk about the drawing.
Okay, thank you for having me and welcome to my studio. My name is Hormazd Narielwalla. I'm a London-based artist. I used to have a background in fashion until I started picking up patterns that were used for making clothes and viewed them as objects in their own right and started responding to them and making collages, prints, books, sculpture. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Hello.
It's really fantastic to have you. Emma.
I'm Emma Hill from the Eagle Gallery. The gallery's actually the publisher of the artist book that is in the drawing show under the gallery's imprint EMH Arts, which I set up over 30 years ago to try and bring artists, contemporary artists and writers together on projects that were realised in the book form with no particular firm remits as to what that form is. So it's a real pleasure that the book's being chosen for the Trinity Buoy Wharf exhibition because my argument has always been that an artist's book can be almost anything you require it to be. So thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for that introduction. What we wanted to do is to talk a little bit about rock, paper, scissors, and Hormazd, it would be great if you could talk us through this. But if you talk about what's on screen and then we'll take it off screen, this just means that people who haven't seen the exhibition or who want to remember what they've seen in the exhibition can see what we're talking about initially. The work drawing show is chosen on the basis of the work itself. So we don't know anything or much about the artists as it's selected, and the project then puts the information around the work that's selected. Clearly with an artist's book, there is some information that people can access at some point, but the work it's the integrity of the work that gets through the selection process. So very much we wanted to focus in the discussions about the work itself, thinking about what it is in terms of its visual values and its meaning and its content that it brings so precisely into the public domain. So Hormazd, would you like to talk a little about rock, paper, scissors and how it came to be?
So in February, my partner and I made a very last minute but much needed trip to St. Ives. The virus pandemic had still sort of, not hit the UK, and we were very lucky to have been able to make that trip. And I've been to St. Ives maybe 15 years ago, and the biggest memory was to sit in Barbara Hepworth's garden, and I recalled that moment and thought how much I missed it, and it was such a pleasure to go back into it. And Emma, who had shown my work 2 or 3 years ago in a two-dimensional context, had always encouraged me to make something on a smaller scale and then perhaps turn it into an artist book. And when the pandemic then completely controlled uh, our country, I decided that now is the time to do it because the scale of the book, as you can see, was really small. And it meant that I could dissect the pages from it and I could be sitting in my dining room making the work. So the uh, the the book completely was made during lockdown through discussions with the binder and my graphic designer and the printers. So it started with the original collages. So I started seeing the plates as an outline in miniature form, and it was a complete contrast to Hepworth's sculptures. And so I wanted to use that as the starting point when making this body of work. So the entirety of the series are 100 little collages with two cutouts which open to a slightly larger scale. But the idea of the circle within a square and lines and using actually colors that I'm not normally so used to or that I worked with, there was an added layer to that too. And then I brought it to Emma and I said, "Oh, what do you think of these?" And that's how this whole project started.
I mean, I think
Brilliant.
this work is actually a very good example of all of us having to sort of be flexible with our ways of thinking and making in this moment. And it's very interesting for me, seeing this work finalized, because it actually comes from a series of conversations that began, as Hormazd says, a couple of years ago, in relation to talking about projects that we might work on together within the context of my gallery, and the idea of possibly working on a sequence of book pages as just a very simple narrative structure. I mean, a narrative structure in a very loose, formal way. And I think that what was interesting when Hormazd first phoned me which must have been March, just as we, I'd had to close the gallery up. And I think in some ways for both of us initially, it was a very useful focus of being able to kind of concentrate on making something. Because Hormazd actually originally asked if I would write something for this project rather than, I mean, at that point, I don't think either of us were thinking of it at that early stage as an artist book at all. It was a kind of project.
Yeah.
And through the sort of development of sort of Hormazd making the collages and me thinking about how to contextualize those in relation to a piece of text that could sort of sit aside them at that point, and kind of not over explain them, but kind of draw out some of the thematics, really, because one thing that really struck me was that Hormazd's work, in my mind, is distinguished by its usually really beautifully bright, vibrant, non-English colours. And it was very interesting for me to see the first, as these collages began arriving by JPEG initially on my email, that they'd become very English in their colour schemes of the greys and the blues and the sort of something that I recognise. And I found them very moving, really, because they were, in my mind, a kind of watching an artist kind of respond to something that was like a sort of lovely vision of something of the very recent past that had become a different experience by what was being imposed on us sort of through the COVID pandemic. And the discussion to sort of, I mean, it was Hormazd's idea really to take it further into some form that, because his practice actually incorporates artist books in different ways quite often. So the discussion about making it into a book, and then ultimately we've just finished an installation of a selection of the originals in a new little viewing room called the Eagle Gallery Cabinet Room, where it sort of focused just very, very simply on the bookwork and a selection of the originals, which again wasn't planned 6 months ago. None of this really existed 6 months ago. It is about 6 months ago.
So here is,
It's pretty amazing. So it's a real lockdown project.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I wanted
Would you like me to come off the slide so that you can be bigger on people's screens?
Oh, sure. So
And hopefully that gives.
And one of the original works, and it's basically exactly the same scale as all the panels in the book. And
you should show one of the collaged pages.
So, for example, this is the tailoring book that I made the works on in the plates.
So it's a handbook for tailoring in a way, isn't
Exactly.
it?
And it's this was the original one, and I just happened to find another one, so it could be potential for another series. And they're basically, just to give a technical aspect to these plates, they're basically diagrams to show a tailor how to cut the pattern with instructions. And so in some sense, they are little people because the dimension has shrunk to this scale. And after making the works, I wanted to capture that moment where you can basically, I've dissected the entire book, and it was about bringing the book back together in their sort of collaged form. And that's how the book was conceived in some sense. So I'm wondering if we can show the audience, because it opens up like a map. So there are 2 sheets of these.
Yeah.
And it basically was a way of, it also became a movable exhibition in its own right, because it allowed the viewer to see all the works in a single way.
Body, yes.
Body.
I mean, they also put the pages, the worked pages back into sequence in a sense, which I mean, one of the many sort of definitions, as it were, of what is an artist book, that I remember sort of from somewhere is, well, it's a series of pages in or out of sequence. So it can be as simple as that. And it was, I think, just to take up on what Hormazd has said about the idea of a sort of bookwork being a portable exhibition space, I think is one that I've always found very interesting in relation to being involved in making books with artists and publishing books with artists. And in the context of this exhibition also, that it plays very much with the idea of what a drawing is as well, because Hormazd has been working from a kind of, in a sense, you could regard the pattern plates as being found drawings. You know, they exist as geometric printed pattern that he's then begun to play with the collaging, and made these found pages his own in that sense. And they are also a kind of play as well with the idea of working in an illusionistic way between 2 and 3 dimensions, because he's used, one of the recurring motifs in the collages is this very signature use of Hepworth's piercing of forms, which instantly gives the collages a potential 3-dimensional reading, even though they're still working with a 2-dimensional surface. So I liked the idea very much that this was taking certainly my thoughts in a number of different directions, from quite formal things to ideas about sort of memory and sensation, that how to me these were also communicating a kind of emotional response to you know, one artist going and visiting the work of another artist and seeing it in a number of different kinds of conditions of light or weather, or also very much to do with the material of the original stone and bronze, and then stone and bronze with rain, or stone and bronze with sun, and all of these things I found that even though they are essentially quite simply, you know, they're made with a relatively restricted color palette. They're made within a pre-given sort of structure, that they were that the work sort of just keeps opening out and opening out in my mind. So I offered Hormazd, you know, the possibility of doing a little exhibition. Again, I don't think really, probably I guess we started talking about that in August. So it was all
spontaneous,
quite spontaneous.
Also, I think the title of the work is quite important, you know, rock, paper, scissors. So the idea that it's in some sense quite playful, and rock being stone, paper being the pattern, and scissor being the cutout. So I thought that was, it just brings it all together, giving that title.
The playfulness of the title is terrific. Do you want to say something about the space between the Hepworth, the book, and how you came to make the book? I mean, is there a process? I mean, there must be a process in between of play and drawing and making collage. And I guess in a way we've talked about it, but I wonder if you want to say a little bit more about that role of cutting with scissors and tearing, or whatever it is that you might do in that constructing process for each of the.
So I think it's very intuitive. I go with the feeling. I don't plan a collage or what I'm going to do. I plan basically the colors that I will use, and then it's about placing the cutout onto the pattern and then deciding which shape is going to be drawn through the you know, through it being stuck. So for this element, like, I don't know if there are any tailors logged on, but they'd recognize that's a sleeve pattern, for instance. And so it's my then artistic sort of decision of which area that I'm going to cover. But I wanted to give these specifically these works a very sculptural feel because of the subject matter. But in essence, patterns are two-dimensional objects that represent three-dimensionality. So there was the basis for that intention was already there. I just had to follow the rules in my mind of how I would create the individual panels.
I think also, if
Sorry,
I
that's
sort of sort of interrupt a bit, that what's also something that I found interesting about the progress of this particular bookwork was that because of the confines over the time it was made, where I was actually incredibly relieved when Hormazd and I first met face to face when we came out of lockdown, because it was the first time that I actually saw the originals physically. And even though I'm used to looking at work all the time as digital files or whatever, that instant reminder of how much more satisfying, as it were, the physical, if an object has been made as a physical object, that when you're seeing that physical object for the first time, that there's the sort of delicacy of the collages that I think is slightly lost in digital, sort of in a digital kind of communication. However, the advantage of being able to print digitally, and how Hormazd has used that possibility to use that technology in terms of the printing, and then to go back to the handmade again. He works with a very good binder, Mazzotti Books, and that the container of the book again has been very carefully thought through with the binder. I don't know if you could open that. So again, it references this idea of the pierced, it's really that the sort of piercing that you don't maybe see that easily, that the sort of detail of something that ultimately, you will hold that box in your hand, you'll notice these kind of finer details to do with it as an object, and to do with it as a little mini sculpture once it's back in its box. All of these things really appealed to me as a publisher, because I'm usually more involved in making, I mean, most of the books that we published are actually still using quite traditional sort of studio print techniques, and it's one of the first times that I've been involved with a book that's using digital print as a sort of important part of its sort of making. So again, the dexterity, I think, of how you can bring different ways of thinking together. That again, I think we're all having to use, you know, knowledge that we've maybe picked up in all sorts of directions along the way, and how to utilize this at this moment. You know, whether that's doing what we're doing today over Zoom, or having, I mean, I think it's brilliant that you've managed to mount the show physically, because I think that having spent a lot of time in the digital viewing rooms recently, which I personally find
difficult,
very disorientating and not satisfying. I think combining, if you can, a physical manifestation of work with all of this is you know, bringing about changes already that I'm sure will hopefully, once things calm down a bit, that will actually have added to our way of being able to communicate what we're about.
I think the beauty is that it has expanded reach, and I think it has enabled us to contact or connect with all sorts of. I have to say that, you know, we've not just put the show on. We did have a phase of seeing the work in the real. Our USP has always been, we choose from things because of the tacit information that you have about a piece of work. And particularly with drawing, quite frequently, and you know, it's very difficult to understand the surface and the construction and the scale even on digital images, no matter how fantastically used to doing it you are. And I think that is the kind of defining moment with the work. I think, you know, with your work, Hormazd, we've watched it go through the long listing online and then into the reel, and it's handleability that is very attractive. It's the tactility of it, even though it's a digital print. And I know, you know, we've had one visitor who said, oh, I really wish I'd seen the real things. And to one degree, you really want that as the temptation, but it's still a physical, handleable thing. And the reproduction has allowed us to see the role of drawing in a different way, in a sequential way that we wouldn't see in the show, I guess. I wonder if you might like to take us, sorry, Hormazd, you first.
I think that in terms of applying for the prize, I did have an opportunity of applying 3 different objects and drawings. So I did contemplate that I should put the book and then put 2 of the works, but I thought that, you know, and there could have been a chance that all 3 could have got through, but I just felt that the 2 standing on their own in the exhibition along with the book would just not hold weight and gravitas. I wanted the viewer to have an opportunity to see the entirety of the series, and that's why I decided I'm only putting the book in as an application. And actually, I may be wrong, but I feel that this year's switch in only bringing the long listed works gave the book time for the judges to look at, because it would have been a very difficult object to look at in a few seconds, which would have been the initial idea. So I knew that was what you all intended. So I decided that the stars were aligning for the book in some sense. So I decided I'm just going to trust the book and put the book in as the.
I think that's really interesting as a decision, because it's a complete project, isn't it? And there was a moment where we thought we might do this discussion with your show with Emma, if we could have worked out how to do it a little sooner. But I wonder if you might want to just give people an idea of your studio. We were saying earlier that we had a studio visit with Ben Johnson last night, and just a very brief sense of your working context, and that actually would be really helpful, I think, to people to see, not to spend too long, but just to have a sense of the kind of space, the kind of way that you construct things. I think would be really helpful at this point. And then we'll go back onto the slides for Q&A in a moment.
I'm just wondering if I can flip it, but I'm still quite. I think it's okay.
I think you might just need to move it to, yeah, that's brilliant.
So this is something that I've recently made after rock, paper, scissors, and it's called Without the Spirit, There Is Only Material. And it's sort of, again, talking about mortality. And so I've basically digitally printed flesh onto actual patterns and then designed a Victorian butcher's shop style graphic cover. So it's sort of the book object opens and closes like a meat box would. And again, it's my dear friend Mazzotti Books who created the box. And then I thought it would be nice to show you some of my two-dimensional pieces. So these are my collages, sort of, again, using different kinds of patterns. So these patterns are French patterns from the 50s, and they would have had an entirety of the garment printed on top of each other. And so as an artist, I'm saying, don't dissect them. This is the end, and see them as an object in their own right. And then this is a book that I made in 2016, and it's called Lost Gardens, and it was a show I did with the South Bank Center, and it was an exhibition in response to Brexit. And so the idea that the garden that was being created no longer exists. And so they were basically just block colored geometric shapes. Then this work is called Flight, and it's basically a three-dimensional piece of lingerie patterns. So the idea that women are throwing their bras into the sky and then they turn into birds. And so it's, again, a response to the patterns, and it's not boxed because it goes against the philosophy of the piece. And also my work sort of bounces between abstraction and figurative. So you can suddenly, a figure appears, and so this is called prayer. So it's a figure kneeling that I've sort of managed to basically, I've managed to depict within the geometric patterns. And then these are called dancing blocks. And so the idea that the patterns were made for dancers. And so it's basically, again, use of block colors and sort of, again, having a conversation with the modernists who depicted dancers and musicians in their work. And this is where you can see all the patterns hanging. And they are quite similar to how a butcher would hang meat. And so that's where the meat book was derived from. And then this is an Edwardian table that I'd found of a memoriam of two young children. And so the idea is that the patterns were used to make flowers, and the two children are reunited with the mother. And also the context of these patterns is they come from Savile Row of customers who've now passed away. So there is an association of death in the sense that I don't get a Savile Row pattern until a customer dies. So that is the reason why I used those patterns in the work. And I also like making very playful figurative work. So that's based on Coco Chanel. And so I started the year thinking it's going to be a decade of the roaring 20s. I guess I was really wrong, but I basically made a series
It's the
on
late
Coco
20s,
Chanel.
not the roaring ones.
And then those are called negative space. And so the idea is the negative aspect of the print is the line and the drawing. And so, yeah, I wonder if you...
I think that's a really fantastic sense of both the way that you work in series, but also the way that these paper patterns, which presumably your fascination with them comes from your fashion background,
Yes,
and
that's
the use
right.
of them. Yeah, and their relationship to the body is this kind of ephemeral thing.
Yes,
Yet
my practice began in Savile Row, and I basically was interviewing this tailor who told me that when his customers died, he would shred their patterns. And so that had a very profound effect on me because it was all about memory and loss, but also a sense that the patterns are a representation of a human being. So,
yeah.
and people don't really keep patterns unless there's a connection with with these paper blocks. And so that's how my practice began. And after I made a book called Dead Man's Patterns, and it was meant to be a creative portfolio for me to get a design job. I didn't know what an artist book was when I was making it, and people responded to it as an artist book. And so I made an edition of 100, and the British Library bought one, and the National Art Library acquired one. So all these institutions were acquiring an unknown person who's just come out of university. And then I get an email from Paul Smith's office, and they said, "Oh, we'd love to see the book." And then he offered me a show, and then Charlotte Holt saw the show and said, "What about doing a PhD at London College of Fashion within your work?" So it all began with this conversation I had with the tailor, and I didn't realize the impact it would have on my life, because that's how I communicate with the world and use paper as a painter would use paint, or um, a pencil.
I think that's really interesting. I'm going to put the slide up for the Q&A so that we prompt our audience to join in. We had one question which was around the title, but you've already answered that. But if I put the slide up, then we can focus on a detail of your drawing. It'll take me 2 seconds to get there. And I wonder if people would like to come in with their questions. So we do have, I know we've got a number of people in the audience who are particularly interested in collage and in actually using found paper to make things around identity in the body. And it's really interesting, I think, that there are a number of you in the show with an interest in collage in particular, and that cut line or the torn line and the associative relationships between found material. So I am encouraging our audience, who I know are there, to pop some questions into the chat. And we'll keep talking, but we will pick them up as we come through, because we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. I'm also happy to pop you on screen if you're happier to do that within that. But I think it's just been really amazing to see the studio, Hormazd, and to understand a little bit more about the practice and how it's come to be. I think it's really fascinating that you met Charlotte Hodes, who of course won the award in 2006 with a really amazing laser cut collage, really around the body, which interrelated her position at the London College of Fashion as a fine artist, clearly talks to this intersection between disciplines and between design and printmaking, collage, and other things. So again, that seems to have been a really productive relationship for you.
It did,
I don't know
definitely.
if you want to say any more.
Yeah, I mean, Charlotte was
And
incredible. So can you hear us?
yes, we can hear you.
So I had a tailoring expert and I had an art based supervisor, and then Sandy Black, who was my director of studies. So the idea was combining tailoring history with fine art practice and creating a body of work which sort of marries the two. And I mean, there's a lot of cubist theory in patterns because you can see the entirety of a subject in a single plane. There's, the idea of the found object, as you say, the patterns. And so it was incredible to have Charlotte on my team of supervisors. And I've sort of been applying for the prize ever since I met her and came to know her as a student and then as an artist. And so I was really incredibly privileged and honored when I got that email to say that, it's got through. I think I was super excited about that, because also it's the idea that an outsider project would be shortlisted for a prize such as this one.
Yeah. I mean, your piece went before both panels, didn't it, as a working drawing as well as
I did, yeah.
A main selection, which was actually really interesting to see because they were both very supportive of the work. I've got a question in from Lisa about asking whether you hand colour the collage paper. And I think that's a question really about the making and...
Sure. So these were not hand colored. These were papers that already existed because as you understand, when lockdown hit, I was just, what can I put into a folder and carry with me home that would, allow me to work. But there have been instances where papers have been hand colored and stenciled. So this one, for instance, basically it's inspired by my travels in Morocco, and all these tiles are basically inspired by ceramic tiles. I mean, the papers are, and so they're all stenciled and hand colored. So this is an example of when I do hand color. And then in this pieces, you can see there are like cloud formations, and so they are hand colored. So there is an element of hand coloring when making. But these papers in these collages for the prize were papers that already existed. Although there is an element of the silver that you see, it was basically the paper merchant told me that they're from Japan and they were from the 70s and they're wood blocks. So that was
Hand printed.
Hand printed.
Mm-hmm.
And the patterns are always found, aren't they? You're not constructing the patterns as well.
No.
I mean, given that you have
Although I was going to say there's a drawn element. I mean, the other side of Hormazd's work, and he's working on a rather amazing project at the moment that but the Chanel drawings show that actually you do draw, but you tend to draw more on the figurative when the work is more
Figurative.
Going towards the figurative.
Yeah.
The Hormazd's actual hand is in the drawing.
Maybe we show it everybody.
Yeah, I mean, if you I think that the work goes to sort of into not different directions, but again, what's interesting about the drawn elements as templates.
Sorry, I've lost. Yeah.
Oh, we've I think we must have lost the.
I think the connection went a little bit unstable at that point. It may have been mine, but I think it may be the moving around.
Can you
So
hear
I
us
think
now?
that's really interesting. Yes, we can hear you now, and we've got a couple more questions as well, which sort of relate in a way. Brilliant.
We'll show
We
you.
have Bowie. One of the questions is about Margaret, who says that she gets a Japanese feel from the work that you've shown in terms of black and white works. I'm not really sure quite what the question is, but there is a sense of gathering references from a range of different cultures, if you like, you know, from Hepworth, from Japan, from Chanel, so from France, from, I think you mentioned Morocco,
Yeah.
and there is something, and?
I mean, it does relate that Hormazd made this just stunning series of how many?
36.
36 unique collages with the figure of David Bowie as the sort of connection, but that idea of how you know his different personas that happened throughout his career, and they're absolutely wonderful. These, I just wanted also, if I may, can I show you the back?
The back, yeah.
Because these are going to be also developed into an artist's book, possibly with elements of this kind of texture of the making of the thing. So reproducing tape and apertures and details that are left from the found patterns. So
Yeah.
things like this writing would have been from the original tailoring pattern. So they're left on the they're left as part of the final work. I don't know if you wanted to.
That's fantastic. It's really great to see. And the question that has come in from Nicola Grelier, who's also in the show, is, do you make work that fits the scale of the body? I mean, because they're almost doll size, aren't they? They're quite...
Yeah, I have gone quite big, but I haven't made life size. I mean, I would. I haven't gone to that sort of parameter of, you know, trying to go much bigger. I suppose I'm in some sense very dependent of the pattern, and so the idea that the canvas is quite important for me. But it is something that I'm thinking about a lot, of going much bigger. And I love her work, by the way.
You two, I'm sure, would have a really interesting conversation together, and maybe that's for later in the tour.
What about me was her flipping her book. So
yeah, that's fantastic. I wanted to ask you about the Bowie moment, because did you make those in lockdown?
yes.
And I was kind of interested, you know, because I'm just thinking about Kansai Yamamoto, who died also during lockdown, and that kind of moment of suddenly reappraising and remembering Kansai's work, which has been happening. So I was interested really in the role of fashion designers or iconic designers. I think Kansai was a bit more than just a fashion designer.
Absolutely,
and there isn't such a thing as just a fashion designer.
Yeah.
But I wondered if that was part of the osmosis of making.
Yeah, definitely.
Or thinking about Bowie.
It's not so much the designer, I would say, that I mean, Hormazd did a series of very similar collages of Frida Kahlo, and were
It was for the V&A.
For the V&A in connection to their Frida Kahlo show. And I think how as with, you know, what fashion is, or what the outside, you know, what the way that she used, as Bowie used, fashion to kind of formulate an identity, almost how she presented herself to the world, was as much a construct, in a sense. It was as much of an artwork in a way, as her painting, in a sense. And I think that the people who, and Chanel as well, I think that understanding of how you can kind of almost like curate a persona, an identity, through what you're wearing, or but also very much through the skill of, again, I mean, all great fashion designers are also great formalists. I think that the cutting of the it's the cutting of the cloth as well as the stitching and the decoration that really defines sort of a great fashion designer, whose designs will also last down through time.
But also my figurative works are not literal drawings of my subject. So these are not literal impressions of Bowie. It's about capturing Bowie's spirit. And so the idea that I first looked at a lot of imagery on Bowie and then deleted the folder because I didn't want to make literal impressions of him. I was just capturing a spirit. And this lockdown sort of, you know, it made you think of every fear that you might have. And I had this thought, would I ever be remembered as an artist if I was to get COVID and perish? You know, the fact that that would not happen, but you were faced with that question. And so the idea that I wanted to remember Bowie during this time, the way perhaps I might want to be remembered as an artist. And so that's why I decided to get to Bowie. And I also drew Bowie from the 70s because when I grew up in India and MTV just came in the 90s, we were like 20 years behind with our knowledge of Western culture in that sense. So I remember seeing Bowie from the 70s, not realizing that it's 20 years behind. And so I wanted to capture that feeling too, which was quite important.
I think that's really interesting in terms of that making sense in the context of, you know, the remnants or the vestiges of people's identity, you know, from the patterns from Savile Row to your memorial cabinet, which is really quite extraordinary. And I think I was just really trying to work through a question in my mind, which was about the sculptural quality of Yamamoto's designs for Bowie and that, but I think you're clearly positioning that in quite a different space. And I think that's, again, a very interesting thing. It's about the iconic memorial. And in a way, the Barbara Hepworth reference also does that, doesn't it? But it does it through reference to the sculpture and the way of making. But I'm really struck by the idea of the real focus about lockdown, and that focus that, you know, this whole project is conceived and made quite, you know, really obsessively through that period of time, and with all the provisionality. And I think there is also something about the work that came in this year. Your work's actually very highly finished, if you like, in its presentation as a book, and it's beautifully considered at every detail, yet the underpinning imagery is actually made of provisional materials, and the way you talked about what I could work with at home and I had to hand.
One of the materials was cutting up a table mat because I felt I needed some color, and the only thing I had access to were these like wired table mats that I wasn't very fond of. So I thought, okay, but I can cut them and use them. And, that was the reality of the situation, of what could I use around me. And also, patterns are objects of homemakers, so maybe if this happened 50 years ago, they would have had patterns hanging in their homes because people made their own clothes. So that was another layer to this particular project.
Sorry, there is something about that provisionality where people did start to make their own clothes. If you think about the Scrub Hub projects, where people suddenly put into use all of those skills. I mean, I grew up making my own clothes too, didn't go out to buy anything because that wasn't on the table that one could. But actually that nature of constructing and making and the translation between paper and pinning and stitching to construct an identity, but also something useful, I think, in the terms of lockdown. We're coming up to 5 o'clock, and I'm wondering, we really should be thinking about wrapping up. I mean, I think it's been really fascinating to hear you talk about drawing and the way that drawing is actually, in a sense, constructed through the scissors and through the cutting for you, and the cutting and the tearing. It's really interesting as a process, your linearity that enables you to construct forms and to play and reflect on the different subjects that you choose. Very certainly comes through a line that's constructed or taken away, and if it's cutting away. But it's been really, really fascinating to listen. And I wonder if you just have anything you want to add in terms of a conversation. There are no more questions coming in through the chat. But I wondered if there's one last thing that you want to say or add to that conversation. It's been really rich and fulfilling. It's been great to see the context in the studio too. I think we're there. We're there. It's time to say.
Yeah, who has been, without this project, I think lockdown would have been incredibly difficult. And I think I was really thankful to Emma, who was constantly watching it and giving her encouragement. And, it turned into an incredible year for my career with the shortlist announcement and the show. And so I'm incredibly
it's been amazing, hasn't it?
Of your story.
Yeah, I think
out of this period, I think it's interesting how, I mean, talk to anybody really at the moment, that this odd sort of enforced, it's almost like we were forced for a while to be really thinking about something in a far more intense way, and dare I say it, far more philosophically than we would normally be thinking about our lives. Who are we? What do we do? What are our jobs? All of this, and and I'm talking as a very, I'm talking as a privileged person who actually has been doing this in my house with enough food in the fridge. That there's been this, in one sense, return to things that are, I mean, what people have returned to in their homes in order to keep sane, I think, gardening, sewing, cooking, that these things that we would normally maybe not think about quite so much, and that with artists who are maybe used to going to studios or using much more possibly grander processes, again, have been forced back to things like drawing, because you can do that with a notebook and a pencil or a pastel, or you don't need a lot of equipment. I mean, I found I was in my garden drawing for the first time in years. Have I sat down and drawn something? But it was and remembering how sort of really focused that one can be in the act of doing something like that at a moment where everything else feels like it's jangling and sort of being, you know, where you can't really, you can't control in the way that you would normally control. And I hope that people will remember that this connection when we start coming out of this, because I think it will create, for example, for artists, I think it's going to hopefully create more audiences, in a sense, who will have a sort of more of a connection somehow to this activity.
I couldn't agree more. Is that
one of the things about this book, and I think that you mentioned it, the fact that one of the main traditions in certain forms of artist bookmaking has been precisely, a bit like with printmaking, to give accessibility to an audience that is wider than simply the privileged audience. And it's great that this particular piece of work, I think, functions in such a way that to really understand it, you need to have the viewer there doing things to this, interacting with the artwork, really, to you know, it's not an artwork that you want just sat in a perspex box. This
I
book.
know we perhaps haven't allowed people to handle it as much as
I
we should.
not.
We should
That's
think about
certainly
that.
the idea. Yes.
That's what I want to check.
But it's
But I
exactly
think
it's to be interfaced
Yeah.
with, in that sense.
Yeah. And the people that have they want
We
invitation is to enjoy it. Sorry, I think my connection's not happy. Can you hear me?
We can now.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Sorry, it's having a moment. But I think there is that thing about its portability and its hand scale that people want to connect to it and touch. And I think I agree with you, Emma, is that a lot of, I mean, we know from the submission, a lot of people have been drawing, and we know everywhere on social media and, you know, the complete expansive nature, that democratic, everybody's got access to drawing, has been really extraordinary to see. And then to see what artists have done when focused on, you know, having to work with what they have, that framework has actually been really interesting. I think we're at the point where we should say a huge thank you. It's been a real privilege to have you both join us. It's been a privilege to have a lovely audience with us too. And I'm really grateful for you for joining us and for sharing more about the practice. It's been great that you've shared the work within the show. And we really look forward to seeing you as the show tours around. We're at the last day of the exhibition in Trowbridge at Drawing Projects tomorrow. And it then goes up to Dundee to the Cooper Gallery until Christmas. And then it goes to Trinity Buoy Wharf in London for the first showing. We should say our launch in September was postponed because we couldn't gather. And we're very much hoping that we'll be able to show the show, we believe. And we'll work our way around how we do things. But it means the awards will be announced in January. And we have no idea who's won. So that's fantastic about all of these discussions. It's a great success for everybody who gets through the process. We had terrific panels, and it will be great to see the responses to the exhibition as it tours around the country. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We have one more live drawing discussion tomorrow evening with Sophia Howe from the Cooper Gallery in Dundee. So it's a bit of a baton handover to the Cooper Gallery, but with one of our selectors. So we hope people will join us again tomorrow. And we also have some broadcast films that are pre-recorded that we'll be sharing on the YouTube channel. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, Emma.
Bye.
Huge thank you, Hormazd, and
No
look
problem.
forward to seeing you again very soon. Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.